Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution's World of Jane Austen series, celebrating the 250th anniversary of this literary icon. Tonight we're on our 7th talk because we had 2 last week and then we had a symposium of 4 talks. So we're now on number 7. And after tonight, we have 2 additional talks. One on Wednesday evening with Marie-Louise Luxemburg, who's in the audience tonight, on Fanny Burney. And is she Jane Austen's favorite author? Is what she's going to be talking about. And then on Thursday, we have Robert Morrison, who's spoken here several times on the Regency period. But on Thursday, he's going to be talking about letter writing and how knowing about her letters might give you some insights into her attitude and what she conveys in her novels. So we hope to see you at these last 2 talks. And now I'm going to turn it over to Joe Houlihan to introduce the speaker.
Thank you, Betty, and thank you for doing such a wonderful job with this series of talks about Jane Austen. I know what a passion it is for you, and I think that's reflected in this sort of amazing schedule, so thank you. So thank you all for coming tonight, and thanks also to the rather large number of people who are joining us online for tonight's talk. So tonight's speaker, Kathryn Sutherland, is Senior Research Fellow at St Anne's College, Oxford. Among academics who take a special interest in Jane Austen, she is certainly among the most highly regarded. She's published many books about Jane Austen and has that rare talent of combining academic excellence with readability, meaning her works tend to be to attract both critical acclaim and a wide audience, which is always nice. They include, over the many years of writing these books, Jane Austen, The Chawton Letters, Jane Austen's Textual Lives, and Jane Austen, Novelist in the World. But perhaps of most interest is her newest book, which is Jane Austen in 41 Objects, published by the Bodleian Library Press. When the various special interest groups here at the BRLSI were asked to suggest ways in which a Jane Austen lecture might fit into their schedules, as a convener for military history, it wasn't at first obvious. But it didn't take too long on thinking about it to realise the very obvious point that Jane Austen was writing her books during the period when Great Britain was involved in a major European war. Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Mansfield Park were all published while the Napoleonic Wars were being fought. Emma came out in 1816, which was a year after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, but it's reasonable to assume that it too was written, at least in part, while Britain was still at war, although I stand to be corrected on that. So, to answer the question of why don't we notice the war in Jane Austen's novels, please give a very warm welcome to Professor Kathryn Sutherland.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Betty. And thank you, everyone, for coming. And I hope you enjoy what I have to say. I hope it might surprise you a little as well. So, Jane Austen, a wartime writer. From his wartime posting in the Eastern Mediterranean, the poet Rupert Brooke wrote home to England in April 1915. I cannot write you any description of my life. It's entirely featureless. It would need Miss Austen to make anything of it. We glide to and fro on an azure sea and forget the war. I must go and censor my platoon's letters. We now are roughly at the same historical distance from the Great War of 1914 to 18 as those men and women who fought and died then were from Britain's long campaign against revolutionary and Napoleonic France, a war that raged for 22 years, from 1793 to 1815, with only a brief respite in 1802 to 3. It was a war that spanned almost the whole of Jane Austen's adult life. Through the 19th century, that war, Jane Austen's war, had come to be known as the Great War and was fought across the same ground, contested 100 years later in 1914 to 18. France, Italy and Spain, the Low Countries, Central Europe and the Middle East. The Great War of 1795 to 1815 was a world war, extending to America in the West and India in the East. In 1914 to 18, soldiers in the trenches were reading the writers of that earlier period of conflict. They were reading Wordsworth, Byron, Jane Austen. In his classic study, The Great War and Modern Memory, Paul Fussell examined the literary frames that gave meaning to the British experience of the 1914 to 18 war. He identified a particular phenomenon that he called the curious literariness of real life, the curious literariness of real life that those in the trenches affirmed in a variety of ways. Novels, volumes of poetry, the latest issue of Punch and Country Life, and even antiquarian catalogues were routinely delivered to the dugouts of Ypres and the Somme by the field post office. British soldiers at Ypres wrote, printed and circulated their own paper, the Wipers Times. Robert Chapman, in civilian life the Assistant Secretary of the Clarendon Press in Oxford, now an artillery officer, planned and executed schools' editions of Mansfield Park and Emma from his 1917 posting in the Balkans. He used the mailbags of the Army Postal Service to correspond with the press. Ever and again, tiring of collation and emendation, he wrote, I would go outside to look at the stricken landscape. Though Chapman's school's editions remained unpublished, victims of the wartime shortage of typesetters, his work fed into his major Oxford edition of Austen of 1923, which, shaped by the experience of war, established her canonical status as a writer who offers a refuge from present realities. Those words, a refuge from present realities, were the verdict on its publication, on the publication of Chapman's edition by Desmond McCarthy in the New Statesman. It's fair to say that the 1914 to 18 war decisively established Austen's high canonical status. Austen's social vision gained new significance in 1914 to 18 because, seemingly insulated from war, it represented an England worth fighting for. England imagined as the immemorial village clustered round the great house and the church. So argued Reginald Farrar in a centenary tribute in July 1917. Farrar wrote, all the vast anguish of her time is non-existent to Jane Austen when once she has got pen in hand to make us a new kingdom of refuge from the toils and frets of life. Her kingdoms are hermetically sealed, in fact, and here lies the strength of their impregnable immortality. It's not without hope or comfort for us nowadays to remember that Mansfield Park appeared the year before Waterloo and Emma the year after. Austen's popular and critical reception through much of the 20th century was built on her ignorance of public events. Summarised by George Steiner's comment that at the height of political and industrial revolution, Miss Austen composes novels almost extraterrestrial to history. Austen's great revisionist critic, Marilyn Butler, described it more subtly as her discreet approach to ideas. No novelist of themes in her own day when political partisanship shaped the arts. To her readers in 1918, searching anxiously for safe harbour, she didn't appear even to have been conscious that she was a wartime writer. The comforting power of Austen's novels is an old idea with deep roots. She soothes her readers because nothing to disturb or disquiet happens in her novels. There's a ball, of course, maybe a picnic, a trip to the village shop, an invitation to dinner with neighbours, some tea drinking and a little gossip. As she herself said, 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on. But turbulent public events touched closely the private lives of several members of the Austen family. Living in Paris in the 1780s, Jane's glamorous cousin Eliza Hancock met and married the Comte de Faide, a captain in Marie Antoinette's regiment of dragoons. Eliza herself danced at a ball at Versailles, where Marie Antoinette was present. A frequent visitor to her Austen cousins at Steventon in Hampshire, Eliza was in England only days before the storming of the Bastille on 14 July 1789. Though she escaped the excesses of the revolution, her husband was guillotined in 1794. During the brief cessation of war in 1802, and now married to Jane's brother, Henry, Eliza made an unsuccessful trip to France to recover the Comte's confiscated property. Settled in London, Henry and Eliza's lives remained closely entwined with those of the exiled French community. Moving in émigré society on her regular visits to London, Jane Austen attended their benefit concerts, heard of their misfortunes, and declared herself amused to see the ways of a French circle. Jane Austen's adult life ran in parallel to Napoleon's rise and fall. They were near contemporaries. 2 of her brothers, Frank and Charles, were sailors who saw service in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars and the American War of 1812. They sent home gifts, gold chains and topaz crosses, bought with prize money realized by the capture of enemy ships. And they wrote letters from the East and West Indies, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, the North Sea, the Baltic, and North American waters. And Jane Austen posted replies from Chawton Village to Captain Austen, HMS Elephant, the Baltic, and to China. Frank Austen, flag captain of HMS Canopus, one of 6 ships of the line sent by Nelson to reprovision, wrote to his fiancée, Mary Gibson, on 27 October 1805, of his great disappointment at just missing the action at Trafalgar 6 days before. As a national benefit, he wrote, I cannot but rejoice that our arms have been once again successful, but at the same time, I cannot help feeling how very unfortunate we have been to be away at such a moment, and by a fatal combination of unfortunate though unavoidable events, to lose all share in the glory of a day which surpasses all which ever went before. This is what I cannot think of with any degree of patience. Frank, Jane Austen's brother, recorded the victory in Nelson's death in HMS Canopus' logbook. Frank's sister, Jane, repaired the record in her 6th novel, Persuasion, in chapter 3, when she allowed Admiral Croft, Rear Admiral of the White. There was also a red and a blue, if you don't know your naval history. I'm a daughter of the Navy, I have to confess. When she allowed Admiral Croft, Rear Admiral of the White, a share in Nelson's victory, while his brother-in-law, the hero of Persuasion, Frederick Wentworth, attains his captaincy after the action off St. Domingo in the Caribbean in February 1806, where Frank Austen again commanded the Canopus. And in a letter of 12 October 1813, Austen joked, "Southey's Life of Nelson. I am tired of lives of Nelson, being that I never read any. I will read this, however, if Frank is mentioned in it." Austen's wartime vision is neither detached nor limited. We've failed to notice her responses to war because her commitment to record events from the perspective of everyday reality leads her to conceal them in plain sight. Her perspective on war is that of the daily routines of women and men who are waiting at home for letters from brothers or husbands campaigning overseas, who are reading the army and navy lists for notice of men killed and officers promoted, and scanning the papers for news. She was a historian of war's domestic front, at a time when communications from and to the theatres of war were beginning to take a shape we recognise as modern. The Times newspaper established a foreign news office during the French Revolutionary War, and in 1799 the Naval Chronicle began publishing. A monthly journal of current record, lists of ships lost, destroyed and captured, naval poetry and biographies of famous sailors, a mix, in other words, of practical information, news and literature. The Naval Chronicle's stated intention was to unite a readership of sailors on the far seas with the general public at home. Frank Austen, Jane's brother, published in it. Written and printed war correspondence brought far-flung campaigns to London, Edinburgh and Hampshire villages, even as the movement of news and information homewards exposed the ignorance one of another of each separate theatre of war. In a global war, where is the front? Home, in this case England, was the place where intelligence was funneled and whence it circulated. The domestic reader couldn't know the immediacy of war, but with official dispatches, war journalism, and an effective postal service, she had the means to be better informed than ever before, could claim greater knowledge of the war than could any one individual actually participating in it. Of course, there were long gaps without news and between events and their reporting. The navalist could only tell you your brother or husband was alive a month ago, and when the Times of London announced on the 2nd of October 1798 the news of Nelson's victory at Aboukir Bay and the destruction of the French fleet, the event was already 3 months old. There was then, in the 1790s, no telegraph as there was in 1914. There was no communication satellites as in the Iraq and subsequent wars of the 21st century, but some features that we can recognise as modern in the second-hand, home-centred experience of war were beginning to emerge. Austen's surviving letters allow glimpses into the unpredictable and circuitous networks by which news travelled to and from war zones. Wednesday, 11 February 1801. A letter from Charles to myself. It was written last Saturday from off the start and conveyed to Popham Lane by Captain Boyle. He came from Lisbon in the Endymion, and I will copy Charles' account of his conjectures about Frank. He's not seen my brother lately, nor does he expect to find him arrived, as he met Captain Inglis at Rhodes, going up to take command of the Petrel as he was coming down, but supposes he will arrive in less than a fortnight from this time, in some ship which is expected to reach England about that time, with dispatches from Sir Ralph Abercrombie. On Thursday, 11 April 1805, she wrote to Charles, in consequence of my mother's having seen in the papers that the Urania was waiting at Portsmouth for the convoy for Halifax, that's Halifax, Nova Scotia, where he was then based. And on 25 April 1811, she relayed indirect news to Chawton, Again of Charles, once more in North American waters. News picked up at one of Eliza Austen's parties in Sloane Street, London. Captain Simpson told us, on the authority of some other captain just arrived from Halifax, Nova Scotia, that Charles was bringing the Cleopatra home and that she was probably by this time in the Channel. But as Captain S was certainly in liquor, we must not quite depend on it. It must give one a sort of expectation, however, and will prevent my writing to him any more. I would rather he should not reach England till I am home. In Austen's letters, war is recast in intimate and familial terms. The truth of reports is weighed and commented on, and becomes a cause for mutual sympathy or congratulation. Distinctions between public and private news quickly break down. Public reports are scoured for private information, while personal communications can carry public intelligence and disclosures to be shared. Nor do handwritten letter and print differ as much as we might imagine in their timeliness or trustworthiness, as we see in Mansfield Park, Austen's third novel, where the newspaper, esteemed to have the earliest naval intelligence, and Midshipman William Price's letter to his sister Fanny, the heroine of that novel, dispatched as his ship came up the Channel, arrive on exactly the same day. In Emma, it's given to Jane Fairfax, a war orphan, whose infantry officer father died in action abroad, to extol the marvels of the post office. The post office, she says, is a wonderful establishment. The regularity and dispatch of it, if one thinks of all that it has to do and all that it does so well, it's really astonishing. Jane Austen is the first English novelist to explore the effect of contemporary war on the home front. We might say that she was war-conditioned. Wartime was the ordinary, everyday time of her adult life, and its effects are evident in each of her novels. Her first publisher, Thomas Egerton, specialised in military and political works from his shop on the east side of Whitehall, just across from the Admiralty Office. He had run his military library for 2 decades when he accepted Sense and Sensibility in 1810 or 1811. His list was composed in the main of military treatises, maps and training manuals, works designed to feed the war effort against Napoleon. He almost never published novels, and Austen was his first female novelist. Few modern readers notice or stop to think what it might mean that Pride and Prejudice, one of the world's most famous romantic comedies, was published in a military library. We know from Pride and Prejudice that by 1813, the south of England resembled a military camp. In 1793, there were only 17 permanent infantry barracks. Within 12 years, there were 168. Militiamen overran the smallest towns, drinking and womanizing. Austen's brother Henry served in the Oxfordshire militia from 1793, rising to the rank of captain before resigning his commission in 1801. Like Wickham in Pride and Prejudice, he was posted to Brighton as part of the Channel defences against Napoleon. Remarkably, given the likelihood of infiltration by foreign spies, military camps were open to the public, who were invited in to admire military manoeuvres. What the people saw at the camps was war mediated as spectacle, extravaganzas of movement, sound and colour, which imitated the theatre of battle. Such theatre provides the perfect backdrop in Pride and Prejudice for silly Lydia Bennet's elopement, when she follows the local militia to their new camp at Brighton. In Lydia's imagination, says the narrator, a visit to Brighton comprised every possible happiness. She saw all the glories of the camp, its tents stretched forth in beauteous uniformity of lines, crowded with the young and the gay and dazzling with scarlet, herself seated beneath the tent, tenderly flirting with at least 6 officers at once. Lydia's soldier fixation was a recognized phenomenon at the time known as scarlet fever. The disruptive effects of the militia on civilian life and morality drive deep into Pride and Prejudice. Its love story, centred on Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, is only resolved after George Wickham, an officer in the militia, absconds with Lydia Bennet. There would be no plot in Pride and Prejudice without the militia. Lydia's elopement is not only the dark counter to Elizabeth's eventual happiness, it actually precipitates that happiness. Living in Southampton in 1807 to 1809, Austen would have seen military preparations at close quarters. Chawton is now a sleepy Hampshire village, but when she moved there in July 1809, it lay at a vital junction on the roads to Winchester, Gosport and London. Making land on the south coast, Napoleon might well have marched with his army past Jane Austen's front door on his way to London. She lived, if you know Chawton Village, she lived on a major coaching road. It was like living on the edge of a motorway in those days. On 13 June 1814, during the false peace and Napoleon's first exile, Jane wrote to Cassandra of the possibility of Alexander I, Tsar of all the Russias, travelling through Chawton, exactly opposite her front door, either to or from Portsmouth. War provides the rhythm to which all Austen's novels unfold, the way they turn on misinformation, plans delayed or disrupted, unexpected interventions, the anxious wait for a letter or for something to happen. For characters within and readers of Austen's novels, the absence of event is the precondition of an invasion of the ordinary by the extraordinary, and for the extraction and minute inspection of meaning from the day's slightest crease. By the 1810s, when Austen was publishing, the big ideas for change driving the novel in the early 1790s appeared hopelessly tarnished. Now, writers of every persuasion manifested a counter-revolutionary conservatism in light of French subjugation of much of Europe, and after almost 2 decades of war. This is the context for Austen's own famous quietism. Quietism is most evident in the 2 great mature novels, Mansfield Park and Emma, written between February 1811 and the end of March 1815, during the late phase of the protracted Napoleonic Wars. In fact, Austen's writing career follows more closely than we might expect fluctuations in the British response to the contemporary situation. From the social and sexual assertion and freer spirit of her early work, through the defensive conservatism of her middle period, and on to a late post-Waterloo celebration of risk in Persuasion and Sanditon. The events of Mansfield Park, published in 1814, are contemporary with their date of writing. The narrative unfolding in the shadow of the Anglo-American War of 1812, the blockade of the Atlantic, and continuing conflict with France. Austen's sailor brother, Frank, on duty in the Azores and the Baltic in 1812 and 1813, was a major influence on the book's moral landscape. He was an earnest evangelical Christian and may have influenced her rather unusual choice of reading during its composition. As she was writing Mansfield Park, she was reading the essay on the military policy and institutions of the British Empire, written in 1810 by Charles Pasley, captain in the Royal Engineers. A book, she says, which I protested against at first, but which upon trial I find delightfully written and highly entertaining. Pasley writes with a soldier's common sense and exasperation at the inadequate preparations and half measures of the British government in the face of Napoleon's brutal fighting machine. Pasley's experiences in the Spanish Peninsula campaign underlie his call for better strategy, a more efficient deployment of forces, and a more professional army to support the risks undertaken by Britain's navy. Pasley writes there, "But how are we to improve the deficiencies of our military system and to acquire greater skill in the art of war? Not certainly by remaining inactive, by never venturing to attack our enemy. It's remarkable that we have had no canting about valuable lives ever urged as a reason for neglecting any opportunity, however hazardous, of destroying the enemy's ships. And yet life is fully as dear to the mariner as to the soldier." Finishing the book, Austen commented that Pasley was the first soldier I ever sighed for. Pasley, of course, is obviously going to appeal to Austen, given that she's inside this book and reading it, because what he is arguing is that, the Navy is hazarding hundreds of lives every day on the seas, but the army is ill prepared to support them. And Jane, with two sailor brothers, is obviously this appeals to her. It may seem like odd reading to set beside Mansfield Park, but I don't think it is if you think about what's going on in Mansfield Park. Mansfield Park is a wartime study of the place of family in the defence of the nation. From this springs the deep ideological freight of apparently personal conversations and the symbolic placing of the major characters in the book. There's the newly ordained clergyman, Edmund Bertram, the energetic midshipman, William Price, who has seen, we're told, every variety of danger which sea and war together could offer. And there's introspective Fanny Price, self-dedicated to nurturing the family's moral welfare. The novel's present time is divided between the spacious, well-proportioned Northamptonshire estate of Mansfield Park and the cramped conditions of naval Portsmouth. But its backdrop is global, comprising Sir Thomas Bertram's voyage to Antigua and William Price's past campaigns in the Mediterranean and West Indies, with North America and the Netherlands in prospect. An English Channel port of great strategic significance, Portsmouth was, in the 1810s, the most regularly fortified town in England, with evidence everywhere of a city dedicated to war. During visits to the dockyards, with its new blocking machinery to the design of the French engineer Marc Isenberg Brunel, during walks on the city's ramparts and saluting battery, and at worship in the garrison chapel, the sophisticated rake Henry Crawford, who only plays at being a soldier in the aborted drama in the novel called Lover's Vows, makes his unsuccessful assault on Fanny Price's heart. You think about it, it's quite odd that Jane Austen should decide to take Fanny Price and Henry Crawford for a flirtatious, seductive walk to actually view Brunel's naval fortifications of Portsmouth, but that's what she does, and we're meant to make a connection. In Mansfield Park, family fortunes offer a microcosm of the nation at war. In war, the family's chief shield is religion. Religion directed outwards to serve a social or public interest. Austen, the daughter and sister of a clergyman, considered her own faith at this time of war as bound up in the reforms spearheaded by the evangelical wing of the Anglican Church, by abolitionists like William Wilberforce and Zachary Macaulay, and members of the so-called Clapham sect, who emphasised the importance of moral rearmament and of setting a good example. The Austen brothers and sisters were part of this socially conservative early 19th century movement for improvement. In 1816, Henry Austen, one-time militia officer and army agent, became an earnest preacher of the evangelical school. A letter of the 2nd of September 1814 to her friend Martha Lloyd makes clear Jane Austen's own ardent opinion at this time that Britain's share in military victory is bound up with the nation's religious health. There was reason for optimism. Napoleon had abdicated only months before, in April 1814, and was packed off to exile in Elba. But the prospect of further war with America was cause for alarm. And here's Jane writing to her friend Martha Lloyd on 2nd of September 1814, "The Americans cannot be conquered, and we shall only be teaching them the skill in war which they may now want. We are to make them good sailors and soldiers and gain nothing ourselves. If we are to be ruined, it cannot be helped. But I place my hope of better things on a claim to the protection of heaven as a religious nation, a nation in spite of much evil improving in religion, which I cannot believe the Americans to possess." War is history, as Catherine Morland, the heroine of Northanger Abbey, confidently understands. But how will war be described, and how many histories might war tell? This is the challenge that Austen set herself in Persuasion, her last completed novel, issued posthumously in 1818. Persuasion is Austen's most time-stamped novel. A tale of mourning and loss, lost youth, lost beauty, lost happiness, lost estates, in which the little non-events of Anne Elliot's private history do duty for years of separation and war. At 27, Anne is Austen's oldest heroine, and this makes for a different kind of novel. This will not be a novel of a woman's coming of age by finding love, but of her attempting to come to terms with love lost and failing to do so. The novel is framed as a sequel. This, combined with the autumn months during which its action is set, makes it a melancholy and intensely romantic tale. Persuasion is also Austen's most auspiciously dated novel. Begun on the 8th of August 1815, a day on which the Times carried news of Napoleon's departure for St. Helena, its action is set precisely 1 year earlier. At this present time, she writes, the summer of 1814, chapter 1. She very rarely gives dates in her novel, but she actually says that in the first chapter, at this present time, the summer of 1814. The reader is meant to notice this summer of 1814 and the slight fictional time lag. Written after Waterloo, the battle that decisively ended the long war, the novel's events unfold before Waterloo, during the brief respite from war following the Treaty of Paris in June 1814, that ended abruptly with Napoleon's escape from Elba in February 1815. In the real and fictional summer of 1814, that peace looked secure. With it, naval officers returned home, among them Captain Frederick Wentworth, who, after 8 years of fighting and promotion and flush with prize money, is a different prospect from the penniless young sailor Anne had been persuaded to reject. We're told in chapter 7, it was now his object to marry. He was rich and, being turned on shore, fully intended to settle as soon as he could be properly tempted. While Captain Wentworth has spent the intervening years since they last met, hazarding his life and advancing his fortune, Anne has found consolation for her diminished existence in published accounts of war. We're told in chapter 4, she had only navy lists and newspapers. Her secret store of naval information supplying the timeline, that charts her own empty years. Anne's recovered happiness is linked to contemporary history in a way that's remarkable and unusual in Austen. Persuasion is a new kind of fiction. It's a quiet historical novel, written at a moment when loud history, in fiction with the success of Walter Scott, and in reality was the thing. Private and public history are gently and subtly entwined in the novel's opening chapters, making it both inevitable and yet matter of almost painful suspense that Wentworth's return from the sea must mean his return to Anne. Unlike any previous Austen lovers, Anne and Wentworth are paired from the start. They share a secret. We're meant to notice just how carefully the narrator removes from the scene everyone else who knows that secret before Anne and Wentworth again meet. Anne Elliot has suffered for these 8 years apart from Wentworth, and he's suffered too, but his suffering is a matter of war and the privations of sea. Wentworth is Austen's most emotionally articulate hero, a structural consequence of the secret that links him to Anne. The almost erotic tension that builds through the novel is witness to how keenly lives are balanced between loss and hope, past and future, in times of crisis. The narrative moves from autumn to spring, and hope recovers. At the same time, that slight time difference reminds the historically alert reader that peace, like happiness, is fragile and not without risk. It seems to me a stroke of genius by which Austen imagines the perspective of a single year's history, at a time when history in the novel meant battle, frontline action, and the Jacobite tales of Walter Scott. The resumption of conflict and with it the threat of loss lie for the reader in recent history, but for the characters in the novel, they are still to come. They're just beyond the novel's frame. The final paragraph tempers Anne's happiness by again merging personal and national perspectives. His profession was all that could ever make her friends wish Anne's tenderness less. The dread of a future war, all that could dim her sunshine. She gloried in being a sailor's wife, but she must pay the tax of quick alarm for belonging to that profession which is, if possible, more distinguished in its domestic virtues than in its national importance. Austen, of course, knew, in case you don't know what her handwriting looks like, Austen, of course, knew, and so did her readers, as she wrote her final eulogy to the Navy, that the battle to end the war was not fought at sea, but on land. But sea was where her own brothers had risked most, and the sea is where she too would set her riskiest novel of all, in a post-war seaside resort. The setting for Sanditon, the novel she began in January 1817, in the last months of her life, and left unfinished, is a new resort on the south coast. On a hilltop looking out across the English Channel, records the narrator, the modern began. I love that phrase. She actually says that, on a hilltop looking out across the English Channel, the modern began. The chief designer and speculator of this new resort is Mr. Parker. He too is a modern type, dislocated by recent events and wishing to make the world anew. In Sanditon, Austen draws a traumatized post-war society, opening to change after decades of confinement and bearing witness in its characters' various kinds of eccentric and bizarre behavior to the mental and emotional scars left by war. One of the characters, Mr. Parker's sister, Diana Parker, is a do-gooder and also a hypochondriac, and her language is peppered throughout with wartime metaphors. It's quite astonishing. She's always opening up trenches and bizarre language, but the characters generally are kind of traumatized in various ways. England's coast anxiously defended against the threat of invasion in Mansfield Park's Portsmouth scenes, is now in Sanditon, 18 months after Waterloo, the site of keen resort wars and an eagerly anticipated invasion from holidaymakers. The novel is filled with topical allusion. Mr. Parker's regret, for example, that his new-built house, Trafalgar House, is not named Waterloo, for, as he says, Waterloo is more the thing now. It invokes the contemporary craze for naming buildings after national wartime victories. London's Strand Bridge, begun in 1811, had been renamed Waterloo Bridge just 1 year earlier in 1816. Even a passing mention of blue shoes. Blue shoes, they're quite extraordinary and they stand out in the novel. Blue shoes casually spotted in a Sanditon shop window is not without significance. Several contemporary commentators noted the craze for blue garments at the time, the shade known as Waterloo blue, after the dye in common use in Flanders. Within weeks of the final land engagement at Waterloo on 18 June 1815, war tourists were arriving in Belgium. Among the first was Austen's contemporary Walter Scott, who set out in August. But even earlier on the scene, within days of the battle, was Charlotte Ann Waldy, whose unflinching account, styled circumstantial details by a near observer of the sights and smells of the Waterloo battlefield, went through 7 editions before the end of the year. Soldiers' caps, pierced with many a ball and trodden underfoot, eagles that had ornamented them, badges of the Legion of Honour, cuirasses, fragments of broken arms, belts and scabbards innumerable, shreds of tattered cloth, shoes, cartridge boxes, gloves, Highland bonnets, feathers steeped in mud and gore, innumerable papers of every description that had been thrown out of the pockets of the dead by those who had pillaged them. French love letters and letters from mothers to their sons and from children to their parents were scattered about in every direction. We found only one English letter. It was from a soldier's wife to her husband. The collection of relics quickly transforms the battle site into something other. A relatively recent equivalent would be the tourist onslaught following the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. Almost overnight, Waterloo, like the wall, shifted from history into myth. Already in Sanditon, recent history has been commodified and packaged, transformed into marketing opportunities. Sanditon is a different kind of reminder that in an age of pitched battles and seeming separation of civilian and military, home and war cannot be held apart. Jane Austen, of course, had always known this.
Thanks ever so much, Kathryn. Absolutely fascinating. And we can take some questions if anyone has them. Please feel free to raise your hand. And we may also invite our online audience to ask some questions as well. I shall go and check for those in there. I can get the ball rolling then. Wentworth. Obviously, so he represents a sort of the self-made man, because he
is self-made.
Through his successes in the military.
Yes.
How untypical, how did that represent a sort of change of society at the time, or was that sort of story commonplace?
That's really interesting. I think it does. But it goes along with, and Jane Austen seems alert to it. Remarkably alert, actually, I think, is that in Persuasion, she is looking at failures of the landed gentry, Anne Elliot's father, has neglected his estate. And, for centuries, it was the gentry, it was men like Mr. Knightley in Emma, who is such a good steward of the land and clearly looks after his tenants and so on. And that was the model, the stable model that had been around for quite a while. And with war, there comes a shift in things, which includes, I think, it includes the opportunities for people without that kind of stability behind them and that kind of inherited wealth to rise to the top. So you can't say it's the beginning of meritocracy, because obviously there have been merchants who've been risking and earning before that, but it is a shift. And Jane Austen clearly recognises it. But yes, there was a lot of prize money to be made. It was distributed proportionately through all the grades of the ship. So as a captain of a ship, you would get a considerable amount of prize money, and he clearly has got that.
Yeah, I think the captain will get most, but all the crew will take a share, diminishing depending on their status. Yeah.
That's right.
Any more questions? Okay.
I must have missed it, but on one of the slides that you flashed up, there was a quote about thousands of people dying on battlefields, and then she says something like, one doesn't care for any of them.
She doesn't say one doesn't care.
Oh, maybe I missed it. Oh, what a blessing that one cares for none of them. No, is she saying, because that's ambiguous, does she mean, well, it's a good job that we don't really care, or is she actually saying, what a blessing, I didn't know any of them?
I'm assuming it's the latter, but it is one of those things, isn't it, that she's very good at saying something that is shocking. That is Jane Austen, that's what she does. But I think, she is saying that, thank heaven it isn't a member of my family. But yes, you're right to want to see that again and read it carefully again.
It does sound a little callous on one reading, but I think that's.
Well, I think it's both.
Yeah, interesting. Question online here. I always thought that the military men disrupting social hierarchies was just a convenient narrative device for Austen. But from what you're saying, it sounds like this was something that was actually happening throughout the country. I think is the question.
It's the militia. It's the militia. Not the regular army soldier, but yes, it's a phenomenon at the time. It is observed by historians that was the case, and it's well attested that a militia camp comes into your town and basically lock up your daughters and close the pubs because there's going to be trouble.
It was fantastic. Thank you so much. Can I ask about whether Austen, either in the novels, and I'm racking my brains for examples, or in the letters, does she talk about the physical scars of war in terms of soldiers coming back with names or physically disabled in some way? Or
you mean the way that Wordsworth does, say in Salisbury Plain? Yes, Wordsworth is so good on that. Well, I think, do you know Persuasion? Captain Benwick, I think he is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. I think that would be a reasonable, obviously that phrase isn't in Jane Austen's mind, it's a very recent phrase, but he's extremely febrile, he's emotionally quite disoriented. I think that would be a reasonable thing to assume.
Okay, question.
Thank you so much. It's really, really interesting. I love your expression for Austen that home and war cannot be held apart. And the subject matter makes me think of similar criticisms laid at the feet of Virginia Woolf, when, for example, she makes a strident attempt at the subject of shell shock with Septimus Warren Smith and Mrs. Dalloway.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
And of course, you know, we have Jacob's Room, Night and Day, various different ones.
Yeah.
But I was very interested because Virginia, I don't know whether everybody knows this, but Virginia Woolf's great-grandfather was Sir James Stephen, and E.M. Forster's great-grandfather was Henry Thornton, and they were both supporters of Wilberforce and founders of the Clapham sect. And I hadn't realised that Henry Austen was an evangelical. I mean, was he part of that group? Would he be later, or was it?
He's coming in. He's coming in later. He's coming in later, but he is hugely influenced by. He's hugely influenced by, as was Frank Austen, Jane's brother. Virginia Woolf. I still think that the very best critic ever of Jane Austen is Virginia Woolf. I think she really got her. And I think to make that link between what Woolf is doing in her novels and what Austen is doing is a very fruitful one. Yeah, so thank you for that.
Okay, another question from the member of the online audience. With Persuasion, you mentioned how Anne Elliot was a different heroine to Austen's previous ones. I was wondering if and how this was influenced by its more historical backdrop.
You mean that she has to be different because of the history?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either. To me, the two just come together so well, the personal and the historical, that I would be very cautious at saying, well, no, she worked out she's going to write something about recent history, and so she has to have an older heroine. I wouldn't say that. I think the merging of the two subjects is just so perfect that I can't tease them apart. I would need the questioner to tease them apart for me, I think. And I'd happily listen if they did, because I'd be interested to know. Yes, write, whoever you are, write to me.
Picking up on your thing about lock up your daughters, which suggests
and your valuables.
Yeah, which suggests to me that morality in the militia was not too high. And yet earlier, I thought you talked about the link between religion and military.
Militia, the militia. It's not the standing regular army. They just have a reputation. I think they just have a reputation. And obviously as well, she is thinking in more abstract terms when she's talking about the defense of the nation. She's not actually thinking about individual.
I wondered if it was a state strategy, though, to try to link.
But it always is. It always has been. I mean, it was in the First and Second World Wars in Britain.
Duty, don't you think? Too?
Sorry?
The idea of duty comes in that.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. But in the First and Second World Wars, you're getting the same links made too, aren't you? Yeah.
I think the regular military were no choir boys either.
Of course they weren't.
I think they were much more corralled by the sort of disciplinary
That's right,
system.
exactly.
And,
whereas, the militiamen were often lodging in people's houses. They weren't held in, as you said, they weren't corralled in quite as strict a way.
they were obviously part of the point of the militia was to be there in the event of an invasion.
That's right.
By the French.
That's right.
They were sort of
A home guard.
Dad's army. It would be like Captain Mannering going with a woman to on sea.
Not that I think Captain Mannering was going to.
But yeah. Any final questions before we finish? Actually, I'm just going to check if our interlocutors of the previous question has come back. Feel free to raise your hand if anyone else has. No, I guess they did all right. You still. So that just leaves me to say thank you very much, Kathryn, for a fascinating talk. Please everyone join me in saying thank you.